Levels of analysis. So once we have our perspective set, we understand constructivist and rationalist and all these things. We also look at our levels of analysis. So we start when we look at individual, domestic, systemic, so structures and processes, and foreign policy. So levels of analysis just tries to describe where each cause originates. So on the individual level, it's called the decision-making level. And so causes are specific to a person or a small group of people. So a single individual's lust for power, a single individual's role in policy making or diplomacy, or a single individual's personal values and beliefs, ideology, or psychology. And this is the most specific level of analysis. So for example, if we're looking at causation, an individual's lust for power may be Napoleon, or the example of Napoleon conquering neighboring territories. Or we could say that Caesar in the Roman Empire, lust for power, or Augustus Caesar in his lust for power, or we could say Adolf Hitler and his lust for power. We could also say that it's an individual's personal values and beliefs, ideology, or psychology, or we can go and that becomes the values of a group. So under a dictatorship, the dictator or that person at the decision-making level could be doing certain things as a lust for power, personal beliefs, ideology could influence, a particular cause. At the domestic level, okay, causes are specific to a state's characteristics. So an individual might have been a leader. At the domestic level, you look at a state. So domestic power politics, domestic institutions, domestic culture, ideology. So in this case, you can say, oh, well, the power politics in the United States helped to lead towards the Spanish-American War. The state's domestic institutions. So for example, you can have a state's domestic institutions help lead towards war. And once again, we could say, oh, in U.S. history, it was the U.S.'s domestic institutions, which was building the Navy, the size of the Navy, increasing its control and reasserting its control of the Caribbean, reasserting its power in the Monroe Doctrine, and increasing its power politics. We see the one call that is also a cause for U.S. involvement in the declaration of war against Spain in 1898. Its culture ideology, same thing. In 1898, a number of Americans argued that it needed to help Cubans win independence from a colonial power, being Spain, and that helped drive the push towards declaration of war against Spain. So at the domestic level, we see those as causes for a war. They can refer to the specific state or a certain type of state. So you can say the United States, as I did in those examples, but you could also say democracies tend to not go to war with each other, but which is an argument that people have made. But just as an example, it could be democracies versus autocracies, or democracies versus communist countries, etc. Capitalist countries versus communist countries, etc. Systemic is how the international system works, or how states relate to one another. So there's two types of relationships among states: the structure, so how they are positioned to one another, and the process, their interactions. So is one state more powerful than another? Are they fairly evenly matched in power? Or is the state A inferior to state B in terms of power? And then the process, do they have lots of interactions or do they have few interactions? So these are all important to find out in understanding the system. So for example, in U.S.-Canadian relations, what are their relative positions? Well, structure-wise, they're equals in a number of cases. But say in terms of economic activity generated, the wealth of the individual countries, okay, the United States rests in a more powerful position of wealth than, say, Canada. But we have regular interactions among these states. We view each other as and treat each other as equals. So these Relative positions, that's the structure. The process, though, is they're both democracies. We both have value similarities, and the interactions tend to be equal. So this is the most general level of analysis. What this predicts is systemic outcomes, not state behavior. So, for example, why a war may occur, not why a specific state starts a war, but it might say the relative power imbalance in structure between two states and the lack of meaningful interaction between them could predict or explain why a war occurs, but not specifically why a particular state enters into that conflict. You would have to go back to more domestic level and individual level to analyze that. Okay? And foreign policy. We find causes found at the intersection of domestic and systemic process levels. So policymakers from different countries, they mediate causes from two levels. So individual policymakers are not a direct cause themselves, but they have to mediate disputes. And so they interact with domestic groups, and there's domestic pressure placed on them to affect certain outcomes or achieve certain outcomes, and they have to then interact with other states. And those two demands might not always be met, or they can't work out an agreement, which can lead to war. So that would be the next layer, or the last layer, or how it's practically sent out. Okay. So now that you've completed this video set, I want you to participate in discussion boards 1 and 2. You may ask questions in discussion board 2 about your content for week 1, and I'll answer your questions. Please complete the review practice quiz. You can take it as many times as you like. It's a multiple choice one, and you can see your answers. And so whether you got something right or wrong, correct or incorrect, which will open up later in the week. Look at the review sheet for the first quiz, which I'll have posted, and take quiz 1. And quiz 1 consists of short answer and essay type questions, which are application questions. So I might ask you a question of how does a realist explain the prisoner's dilemma and why? Or what does a realist believe and why? Okay? I will indicate to you on the quiz how many points, how many questions are on it. And so please be as thorough as possible when you answer questions. Make sure you answer all of the questions completely. And I will, like I said, if you ask questions on discussion board 2, please do so. I also have an activity for you in discussion board 1. Please work on that and try to apply some of your perspectives to the Dice Wars game that you'll play.